greed factor out there. Companies are not perfectly altruistic, certainly the government's not. Many times we aren't.
Right.
What do you do about the obscene profit motive? So I'm thinking of a company like Theranos. Are you familiar with Theranos?
I think so.
They made they made all these things and they sold them for a ridiculous amount. It turns out they weren't that effective. Or the company that did the EpiPen thing, right? All of a sudden they took over EpiPens and they were $900 or whatever of EpiPen. Or the price of insulin, which also took astronomical jumps, and then recently the government has stepped in and capped the price of insulin.
Right.
What do you think about that? What do we do about the obscene profit motive?
So there are a lot of things that allow companies to gain those obscene prices. Sometimes they petition for price controls that allow them to do that, but other times they also try to become monopolistic, and there's ways that they do that without employing the federal government, but a lot of times they can do that with different subsidies, and that's also part of the problem of federal government. And so the government should be facilitating a market where people are competitive instead of a market where people can just plead to the government to put them on a platform above everyone else.
Okay. But what if I'm the only one that makes something? And I can charge whatever I want for it? Should the government be able to step in and do something about that?
No.
Okay. You don't think government has any role then? Say, if I'm the only one, I make, there's a cancer medicine, just name escapes me right now. It's $40,000 a treatment. Only one company makes it. It's for some kind of pancreatic cancer. They should just be able to charge $40,000 a treatment for it?
Well, yeah, pretty much. But
Okay.
also, I think that there are some ways that the government can regulate things like that without going federally. So if a state tried to regulate that, then it would force the company that's producing it to choose, is being in this state having to provide this cost worth it, or should I try to move to a different state? And that may force a business to reevaluate their business plan.
Okay, so say I do that, but so say I'm in Iowa and I have pancreatic cancer and I need this $40,000 a shot treatment or whatever. But company said, man, Iowa's, Governor Reynolds stepped in and said, nope, you can't charge more than $10,000 a treatment. But I can go to Missouri, or the company says, well, Missouri's not regulating at all, so they're only in Missouri. What happens then? I just die.
Yep, pretty much, no.
The reason I asked the question, I'm not trying to trap you, okay? It may feel like that right now, but I'm not trying to trap you. Is that I think it's easy for us to look strictly at the law. And you know me well enough to know pretty much in general I agree with you on almost everything. But there are ethical considerations sometimes that I don't have great answers for, and probably you don't either. But where sometimes the government steps in and it seems like, yeah, it's probably not constitutional, but I wonder if sometimes, and maybe I'm thinking out loud here, trying to get you to think out loud, sometimes that's okay, because the end result has more to do with helping people than it does just with strictly,
Right.
I mean, not that the government probably would abuse that.
Right, I think your point is valid. The problem is that once you give the government certain powers like that, they can also cause those problems. So a company that is creating that cancer cure, they could appeal to a government that would force them to bring it in at a specific price, to give them certain advantages that might allow them to bring it at an even higher price.
Yeah. When the government takes an inch, they like a mile. Good answer. So, did you have another?
Go ahead.
Oh, you go if you want.
No, I'm fine.
Okay, so, let's think about the idea, really kind of hung up on these price control things, but it seems like a country that has nearly complete control over their economy at a federal level and price controls, yet seems to be extremely prosperous. Of course, we're talking about China. China seems to be very prosperous, and they seem to be growing economically, and of course, we all know that they have pretty much, certainly way more control than our federal government does over their economy.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious what you think about that and how that fits in.
China is kind of weird. They do have a lot of control from the government. Like, yeah, they're pretty totalitarian, but at the same time, they've found a way that they can allow companies to compete with each other while still being like very much under the thumb of their government. So it's a weird capitalist, like totalitarian system.
But it seems to be working.
It might seem to be working, but there also are a lot of problems in China with like human rights that, like the Uyghurs that are pretty terrible. So I wouldn't say that that's necessarily something we want to go to.
But is the problems of the Uyghurs, you know, or what are those related to the control of the economy? I mean, I'd say
Yeah.
that's a, you know, kind of a separate issue. I feel like maybe we should have more totalitarian control over our economy so that we can be that prosperous.
Yeah.
Seems to work.
Right, and this is the thing with their capitalist and also communist system, is that their economy is highly underregulated as far, like relative to America. There are a lot of things you can produce in China that you cannot produce like anywhere else in the world. Especially when it comes to things like lead, various chemicals. So they have a lot of economic advantages just from that standpoint. And also,
Now, before you go on, would you say that's a good or bad thing?
it's definitely good for like their numbers.
Good for the numbers, but would you say good in the long term, absolute?
Definitely
sense?
not in the long term. It
Okay.
provides a lot of, it provides a lot of harm to the individuals there. And they don't, also because of that, they don't have a lot of safety precautions. Because of that lax regulation, they're allowed to treat, their workers a lot worse.
Okay. So some of our regulation is
Yes.
beneficial then?
Right, but it
Or,
needs to be
you know,
done-
environmental regs and that sort of thing?
Yeah, but it needs to be done in a competitive system.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
In your price controls, did you look at any industries like John Deere in the 70s? I think there were price controls and what effects they had.
No, I have not.
Okay.
So one of the things you talked about is how the federal government has expanded their power. You briefly talked about it through agencies and departments and stuff. None of which are really in the Constitution, right? I mean, there's no Department of Education in the Constitution, or
Right.
Department of Energy, or you know,
Okay.
Department of whatever one they want to come up with tomorrow. You know, Department of Drywall or whatever. What do you think, and I realize I'm moving a little beyond the scope of the paper, but I'm curious as to your thoughts, considering what would happen to some of those things with states taking control of them versus the federal government. What do you think should be done about that?
Right, so I think that the federal government, obviously just deleting federal agencies could be quite catastrophic, because it would just become a free-for-all for a lot of businesses. So I think there definitely needs to be a slow process in which a lot of these rights that are federally appropriated can be returned to the states. But yeah, I don't have an exact plan for that, but that's sort of how we need to go.
Well, and I realize it's a bit me pushing beyond the scope of your paper, but I was curious what you thought about that, and I think that's a very balanced answer, because we hear sometimes from you, let's just abolish the Department of Education, and believe me, deep in my heart of hearts, I feel that. But to do that just tomorrow,
Right.
that could, I mean, considering how much money, for example, the Iowa Department of Education receives from the federal government,
Yeah.
which is really, where did they get that money? Oh, my wallet. But anyway, or they borrowed it from China, one of the two. But, yeah, it seems like a lot of the things that your paper would suggest we should do, which was really just a return to if I'm understanding you correctly, a return basically to a much more states' rights oriented
Yeah.
country, right? Because I mean, it doesn't apply to just the economy, although obviously your paper focuses on the economy.
Right.
But in all these areas, right? But it just can't happen overnight.
Yeah.
So, as much as we'd like it to, we could be a disaster. Okay. I appreciate that, because that's a very nuanced view when you think about it, because we've all heard the people, they're just like, abolish it. That'd be great, but.
Do you have a final question?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay, all right. Let's give a hand to James.